The Roman Catholic Church and Slavery. Some historians argue that if churches had used their power, the Atlantic slave trade might have never occurred. By the same logic, others argue that the Catholic Church and Catholic missionaries could have also helped to prevent colonization and the brutality of colonialism in Africa as a whole. History shows that the Catholic Church did not oppose the institution of slavery until the practice had already become infamous in most parts of the world. In most cases, the Church and Church leaders did not condemn slavery until the 17th century. The five major countries that dominated slavery and the slave trade in the New World were either Catholic or still retained their strong Catholic influences, including Spain, Portugal, France, England, and the Netherlands. Pope Pius IX himself said, "Slavery itself, considered as such in its essential nature, is not at all contrary to the natural and divine law, and there can be several just titles of slavery, and these are referred to by approved theologians and commentators of the sacred canons. It is not contrary to the natural and divine law for a slave to be sold, bought, exchanged, or given." The actions of the Catholic Church towards slavery proved to be insincere. History shows that the first extensive shipment of black Africans that would later become known as the transatlantic slave trade was initiated at the request of Bishop Las Casas and authorized by Charles V in 1517. Ironically, Catholic missionaries such as the Jesuits who owned slaves worked to alleviate the suffering of Native American slaves in the New World. While showing mercy to Native Americans, the Church placed some books critical of slavery on the Index of Forbidden Books by the Holy Office between 1573 and 1826. Capuchin missionaries were excommunicated for calling for the emancipation of black slaves in the Americas. At various points, the Catholic Church would appease its followers in their conscience by trying to find a middle ground. Because Catholics considered baptized slaves in full communion with the Church as opposed to some non-Catholic colonies, masters could not kill a slave without first facing murder charges. If able, slaves had the right to purchase their freedom, referred to as an act of manumission. Slaves could not be worked on Sundays or on the 30 Catholic feast days, guaranteeing some days of leisure. Slaves could also join lay Catholic fraternal organizations alongside free blacks. All of these protections perhaps provided slaves in Catholic territories with a degree of protection from the harshness of the dehumanizing experience of slavery. Amazingly, Catholic bishops would publicly condemn slavery but privately allowed it to continue in colonies that economically enriched the Church. Finally, in 1965, the Second Vatican Council declared that forced slavery was an infamy that dishonored the Creator and a poison in society. The timeline of the Catholic Church at critical points in history, including slavery. In 362 AD, the local council at Gangra in Asia Minor excommunicated anyone encouraging a slave to despise his master or withdraw from his service. Between 354 and 430 AD, Saint Augustine taught that the institution of slavery derives from God and is beneficial to slaves and their masters. In 650 AD, Pope Martin I condemned people who taught slaves about freedom or who encouraged them to escape. In 1179 AD, the Third Lateran Council imposed slavery on those helping the Saracens. In 1226 AD, the legitimacy of slavery was incorporated in the Corpus Juris Canonicae promulgated by Pope Gregory IX, which remained official law of the Church until 1913. Canon lawyers worked out 4 just articles for holding slaves: slaves captured in war, persons condemned to slavery for a crime, persons selling themselves into slavery, including a father selling his child or children of a mother who is a slave. Between 1224 and 1274 AD, St. Thomas Aquinas defended slavery as an institution by God in punishment for sin and justified it as being part of the right of nations and natural law. Children of a slave mother were rightly slaves, even though they had not committed any personal sin. In 1452 AD, Pope Nicholas V issued the papal bull Dum Diversas on 18 June 1452. It authorized King Alfonso V of Portugal to reduce any Saracens or Muslims and pagans and any other unbelievers to perpetual slavery. In 1493 AD, Pope Alexander VI authorized the King of Spain to enslave non-Christians of the Americas who were at war with Christian powers. 1494 AD, Pope Alexander VI, in the 1494 Treaty of Tordesillas, divided the known New World between the two countries, as there was a need to locate a group to work in areas where the supply of indigenous labor was insufficient to sustain their colonies, so Spain and Portugal imported Africans. Between 1500 and 1850 AD, 12 million Africans arrived in the Americas to toil as slaves. The vast majority of these slaves worked in the Catholic colonies of Spain and Portugal. In 1548 AD, Pope Paul III confirmed the right of clergy and laity to own slaves. In 1866, Pope IX declared slavery itself, considered as such in its essential nature, is not at all contrary to the natural and divine law.
Chapter 11. When will we memorialize the victims of our Holocaust? It is unfortunately forgotten that during slavery and colonialism, Africa and its people suffered the greatest loss in population and cultural devastation of any people in history. There is no memorial calling attention to this event any place in all the world. The Africans in Africa have not properly memorialized their loss, and the Africans outside of Africa, the major victims of slavery and colonialism, have erected no edifices or monument to remind their children that some of them survived the greatest protracted crime in history. I maintain that the people of the entire African world, both in Africa and abroad, are delinquent in their responsibility to their ancestors until some proper memorials are erected in every place in the world where there is an African population. This subject is so big that it is frightening. I wonder why people as large as we are, engaged in as many activities as we are engaged in, have witnessed so long to think of addressing ourselves in the subject, the Middle Passage or Holocaust. It is our Holocaust because this is a Holocaust that started 500 years ago and it is not over. We do not start our count at 6 million. We start counting at 60 million. And we have just begun to count. Now, I do not mean to negate the German or the European Holocaust. Whether the number was 6 or 60 million, even if it was 3 million, it was wrong. But it was a problem started in Europe by Europeans. There's no comparison between this tragedy and our tragedy, which is the greatest single crime in history of the world. Why haven't we memorialized our dead? It is almost like the crime of not burying them. Let's look at it historically, broadside, before we come to the subject. Why are we a people whom so many have said have no history, pursued by so many other people? Why is it that we have been a prize to be captured down through the years? It is because of a prevailing thing that prevails right now. African people have been under siege for over 3,000 years, and for some reason, they are under siege right now. African people have always had and still have something other people want. They think they can't do without it and don't want to pay for it. You just keep the word apartheid about South Africa. It is a minor issue in comparison to the real issue. The real issue in South Africa is a form of economic slavery. It is Western domination of the mineral wealth of South Africa and subsequently the mineral wealth of the whole world. The assault on South Africa, the assault on Africa in general, is an assault on the gold in the Western Sudan, and there lies the major gold of West Africa. Except for it, the economic system under which you live would not be the same or even reasonably the same. Let us go to the background of the tragedy, because very often you think that this happened quite by accident. Let's set the stage for what happened. It is too big for literature. Let's put it in the realm of theater. It was a world drama, a tragedy, and it started inside the European mind. Let us look at the 200-year turning point in world history between 400 and 600 AD. Let's look at where Europe was. Europe had just finished the period of the Crusades, one of the greatest phony charades in human history. It had nothing to do with religion. It was a political move to divert the attention of Europe from the fact that the church had played so many games on the people that the people were about to explode and destroy it. So they found an issue to divert the people's attention from that fact. Once they started them to marching and going to rescue the Holy Grail, which wasn't really lost in the first place, they would forget that they had been bled dry to build those cathedrals so that all the priests and monks could live in luxury while most of the population of Europe lived in poverty. They would forget that Europeans had, to a great extent, enslaved themselves. Feudalism was still rampant in Europe. Now, to divert their attention, they needed an issue: the Crusades, the rescue of the Holy Grail, and the fight against the hated infidel became the great issue, right? The Africans and the Arabs had blocked the Europeans' entry into the Mediterranean since 700 AD. When the African general Tariq bin Ziyad had conquered Spain, it was an African-Arab partnership. Now, when the Arabs write history, they leave out the Africans. And when the Europeans write history, they also leave out the Africans. So therefore, if you want to get the story, you write the story. We're at the end of this dominance, the great flourishing period of scientific discovery. You assume that when Europe was having its Middle Ages, everyone else was having theirs. There were people in the world who had no Middle Age, no age of backwardness, no feudalism, and these people were in Africa, inner West Africa, the Western Sudan. Three great magnificent African states, Ghana, Mali, and Songhai, unfolded while Europe was having its period of depression. The last of these states was now reaching its apex of its grandeur. In 1415, now listen, in 1415, the Portuguese attacked a part of Morocco, a little place called Ceuta, and for the first time in European history, had taken over some African territory. This put heart in Europe because they had at last invaded the territory of what they considered to be the hated infidel. At this juncture of history, everyone not of your chosen religion was considered to be an infidel. The European Christian called the Arab infidel. The Arabs called the Christians infidel. They had been capturing each other in the Mediterranean, but for the first time, the European Christian had taken some land from the African. Welcome back. Welcome back. Welcome back. Happy Monday. Welcome back to On the Shoulders of Giants. I am Joseph Ward. Continuing my reading of Dr. John Henrik Clarke's book, Christopher Columbus and the African Holocaust, Slavery and the Rise of European Capitalism. And this is the final chapter, chapter 11. When will we memorialize the victims of our Holocaust? Starting on page 93. And I started with the video because it goes with the theme of this chapter, how the Pope and the Catholic Church played a great deal in ushering white supremacy and slavery into the world and led to the discovery of the New World and white supremacy flourishing through the Caribbean, North America, Central America, and South America, right? And throughout other parts of the world that they may not have been able to flourish, right? So leading I just read in 1415, the Portuguese captured Ceuta in Morocco. In 1415, that's the first time that Europeans had captured any part of any African territory, right? So between then, that was the kickoff leading on down to where we are today, right? But the Pope and the Catholic Church and how they basically gave the nod for slavery to happen. They said, go ahead, bring us back some slaves. Because, they would say by the decree of the Catholic Church, we declare this land ours. We've conquered this land. This land is territory of Portugal. This land is territory of Spain, of the Catholic Church, yada, 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 right? And so, as they showed in the video, they had the idea that God ordained this. God said that it was okay for us to enslave you. our God, because our God is more powerful than your God. Look at what we have. Look at what we're able to do to you. Look at how you're living. You're backwards. We're going to convert. First of all, we're going to convince you that you're backwards, because you need our God to change all y'all worldly and secularly and wild animalistic ways. Why do you live like that? You should live like us Europeans who don't bathe, who kill each other and have been fighting with each other for the longest. I mean, we animalistic, but we ain't animalistic like y'all. At least we pray to God. And y'all pray to gods, but y'all don't pray to our God. You know what I'm saying? So y'all ain't really real humans like us. That's how they spit in the game to them. And it's like, it's insulting to the humanity, the intelligence, the spirituality, and just the existence of African people for Europeans to show up and just say, hey, our God said that we can do this. We're decreed by the Pope. The Pope is the physical representative of God. So the idea, and you heard what Dr. Clark, what I read, what Dr. Clark was saying, the idea of Europe now uniting under the idea of we have to capture and enslave and civilize these infidels. These infidels are our enemies. These infidels are a threat to Christianity and the Catholic Church. And we got to get this Holy Grail too. Right? So social engineering is not new. The Europeans, what we're learning is Europeans was able to sharpen their skills on each other. So when they met us, they was already ready. They was ready when they met us, because a lot of the tactics that they used on us, they already practiced on themselves. Social engineering, just straight domination, like lying, spreading diseases, like the religious warfare, the manipulation, all of that. They used it on themselves. And then they come back after they perfected it by using it on themselves and used it on us. Greatly. All right, so let's get back into page 95, the last paragraph on page 95. In 1415, the Africans and the Arabs. Oh, hit that like button, comment, subscribe, share. Make sure as many people as possible can get this information. This is a great book, Christopher Columbus and the African Holocaust. Link in the description for you to get your copy. If you haven't already got your copy, you tripping. Remember, this is the last chapter. So after this video, we will be voting on my post. Go to my post and vote for the next book. And I'm going to put up our choices. So we're about to get it into the next book. But I enjoyed reading this book, and we finna finish out strong. So let's go. In 1415, the Africans and the Arabs were having an argument in Spain. And this argument was weakening their hold in Spain. In 1455, and listen to the dates as well. Listen to the dates that I'm saying. In 1455, Spain and Portugal had gained enough freedom from African Arab domination of the Mediterranean to go to the Pope to seek arbitration, because now they were getting colonial ambitions of their own. They said, once we are free of Moorish domination, what are we going to do? They were now talking about what part of the world they were going to take. The Pope, setting the argument, said, you are both authorized to reduce to servitude all infidel people. He issued a papal bull to this effect. I'm assuming that some of you have read Eric Williams's book, Capitalism and Slavery. This event is well documented in other books, but best done in Capitalism and Slavery. So Dr. Clark is recommending us get buy and read Capitalism and Slavery from Eric Williams. Europe is awakening from its own lethargy. Prince Henry called Henry the Navigator, although there was no evidence that he ever went to sea, finds a cache of maps. The maps were used by Jewish gold dealers in the Western Sudan. The Jews had access to the Western Sudan before anyone else, in preference to others. It is another lecture for another day, but over 3,000 years, people called Hebrews or Jews have been given preferred treatment over other people, a fact which they have never acknowledged to this day. They were given preferred treatment in the trade of gold in the Western Sudan, and they were the major gold dealers between Spain and the Mediterranean states and the nations in Africa called the Western Sudan. They had made maps of the areas going to the Western Sudan, and these are some of the maps that Henry the Navigator got a hold of to start the school of chart making and map making. Europe had lost the concepts of longitude and latitude, but they learned from the information gathered in Spain and preserved by the Africans and the Arabs, collectively called the Moors, at the University of Salamanca. There were only two great universities in the whole world at the time, Salamanca in Spain and Sankore in Timbuktu. There was no Harvard now, no Cambridge, no Oxford. None of these schools were in existence. Two universities in the whole world, one solely manned by Africans, Sankore at Timbuktu, the other partly manned by Africans in Salamanca in Spain. They had translated the maritime information coming out of China, the leading maritime nation of the world of the day. With maritime knowledge, the European goes out to sea. The Africans have also preserved the intellectual masters of Europe, Plato, Aristotle, and Socrates, as well as some of the bases of European Christianity. Europeans would now use that information to turn on the people who had preserved it. No one has ever sent us a thank you note for anything we have ever did for them, which makes us totally unobliged people. We're unobliged to anybody for anything. Hell on, right? We owe no one anything, politically, left or right. Everybody who has come among us has taken away more than they brought and more than they gave. We have been humane to all people we have met. No one ever fought their way into Africa. They came as guests and stayed as conquerors or slave traders. I'm just be quiet so I can let that sit in for a minute. They came as guests and stayed as conquerors and slave traders. What have we learned from that? With Europeans beginning to see the light, they start looking for something to replenish their empty bowels. They are now coming out of the lethargy of the Middle Ages. They have survived famines and plagues and lost 1/3 of their population. They are looking for the spices and sweets of the East. They were not looking for Africa at first. They were looking for something to put on that gosh darn awful European food they could eat, so they could eat it. And they discovered Africa en route. They discovered a richer prize while seeking a route to the East, and they captured this prize instead of pursuing the route to Asia. They would get to Asia and find Asia more politically sophisticated because the Asians were accustomed to conquerors and visitors with no good intentions. Europe would have to deal with the Asians in a different way. The Asians would have invaded them, the Asians would have invited them to dinner, but they would have watched them through the dinner, and if they suspected they had any evil intentions, they might have slipped something into the food. But the Africans were generous, and that's why they were trapped. What have we learned from that? The Portuguese began to come down the coast of Africa in 1438, but then began to take slaves out of Africa until 1442. I'm going to read that again. The Portuguese began to come down the coast of Africa in 1438, but didn't begin to take slaves out of Africa until 1442. The taking of slaves out of Africa started with a misunderstanding of African internal servitude, which was based on the extraction of labor after war captivity. Many times Africans captured in internal wars, sometimes just skirmishes, had to work so many months or years as penalty for losing the war. There were no great casualties. After serving the period of indenture, they would go free. You lost the war, and that was what you had to do. Once there was an accumulation of labor over the above that which could be used locally, since the Africans had no massive transportation, they began to use Portuguese ships to lend that labor to other kings or chiefs further down the coast. The Portuguese interpreted this as Africans enslaving other Africans and subsequently used this as a rationale to do the same thing. The role of the Africans in the slave trade is still being misinterpreted by Africans, African Americans, and especially white scholars who are not scholarly enough to understand that the Africans could not have possibly managed or set in motion anything as massive as the 3-continent industry of the Western slave trade, right? Let us look at the beginning, let us look at this turning point in history, this 200-year turning point with Europe coming out of the Middle Ages and relearning the skill of shipping. Europe, having lost its sentimental attachment to itself and that of other people, then began to explode. We must look at the world after 1492, but even before that, there's a date that you have to reconsider. 1482, when the expedition sailed down the coast of West Africa and demanded to build the fortress of Elmina. In this grouping of ships were sailors and soldiers waiting offshore, for if the king didn't buy the Bible story, they had to buy the gun story. The Portuguese forced their way in and built the first permanent fortification, Elmina Castle, the largest slaveholding fortress in all of West Africa. In this expedition was a little-known sailor, Cristobal Colon, later known as Christopher Columbus. He said in his diary, "As a man and boy, I sailed up and down the Guinea coast for 23 years." What was he doing up and down the Guinea coast for 23 years? He was obviously in the early Portuguese slave trade. This is why once he and his disease-ridden men had almost destroyed the Caribs and the Arawaks, whom he mistakenly called Indians, he himself suggested bringing Africans to replace them. He had asked Father de las Casas to go to Rome and get sanction of the church to do so, and this Father de las Casas did. Of course, near the end of his life, Father de las Casas said it was wrong to enslave the Africans as well as the Indians. That was 35 years later. The Indians were dead, and some of the Africans were dead. What I'm trying to look at is that the war on Africans started before he got on the ship. This was a war waged on the structure of African society, especially the family, and that the attack on the black male started right there, and it continues to this day. The Color Purple was not a movie. It was a continuation of that war. You might have looked at it for entertainment, but that was not entertainment. It was propaganda, as skillfully put as the propaganda that came out of Nazi Germany. More skillful because blacks participated in it and rationalized it and said it was art. And so it's getting at that. It's getting at the mentality of breaking down the idea of the black man, but also how, like he said, war, that was when war was officially waged upon the Africans. And, you know, Professor Carl Tone Jones is always reminding us that we're at war. So Dr. Clark is just letting us know when this war started. This war started at least 1482, or at least when Columbus started sailing down the Guinea coast, right? When the Portuguese started forcing their way onto Africa, that's when the war against Africans started, when they built Elmina Castle, when they built Quato. That's when Dr. Clark is saying the war on African people started and the war on black men started. Historical context. I've gone through these slave forts, most of the major ones. I went through Gore, the slave fort in the French area, and that's the third time I've gone through that one within the year. If you look at the structure, you see that it was designed so that the slave settlers lived in luxury over the slave dungeons below. Upon the onset of evening, the women would be assembled in the courtyard so that the captors could pick out one they wanted to violate that night. These Africans had not even left Africa yet. We see that the beginning of a process which we have not dealt with as a people, bastardization, when they had not only bastardized the body, they bastardized the mind. Today, you can find a jet black person with a bastardized mind. He doesn't know where his mind is, or who he's loyal to, or who his paymaster is. But that process of physical bastardization would begin there, and part of the mental bastardization would also begin there, because sometimes they kept back the mother and the bastard child, so they would later become part of the slave trade system in the village around the fort. But now, once the system got underway and the people were on their way to the various markets, we have another process, which is the same process on a slightly different way. This is a tragedy of such proportion that it taxes the imagination of some blacks want to forget about it, and maybe this is why they have not memorialized our dead. This constitutes the greatest number of unmemorialized people in the history of the whole world. No other people have permitted that many of their people to die and have not attempted to make a sustainable memorial for them. I say again, it's like having not buried them. It's like they're all still there, like their voices are still there. They have left us with something. I remember speaking to Ray Charles once, and I was trying to explain the particular nature of the genius in his voice. And he didn't get the point I was trying. He didn't get to the point. I was kind of sorry that I had to put it that way. I said, Ray, the particular genius in your voice is that of protracted crying. That's the wail and the crying in those slave ships coming back down through the genes and through the years. He shook his head and said, where did you get that crazy? Where did you get this crazy cat? I wish I could see him. He missed the point. I had never been more sincere in all my life, and I believe that the genius in our survival is what we have misunderstood. When we discuss the numbers lost in the trade, we are in an endless discussion of how many, and that depends on who you are listening to. If 20 million cleared through Goree, that's just one fortress and not even the largest one. 20 million cleared through that one place, and Goree was late in getting started, and the monster and the largest of the slave forts was at Elmina Castle, whose dungeons could hold over 1,000 at one time. Let's put these together. Another figure to add is that those lost in the movement from the hitherlands to the coast. Sometimes 7 out of 10 got lost. Sometimes slave catchers in competition with each other, or just for meanness and spite, killed each other's captives. That means that 100% got lost. 10 out of 10 got lost. Now, these are the statistics that didn't get into anyone's computer. Some of the slave captains and the thieves cheats working for absentee slave owners. They would load, say, 350 slaves on a ship, list in their log 300, stop at a port and sell 50, and put the proceedings directly in their pocket. These statistics got lost. These statistics didn't get into anyone's computer, but the money got into their pockets. I'm saying that nearly every figure that you hear could be absolutely wrong or could be partly right. But if it's a low figure, it's fully wrong, right? But understand what is happening now. There was no resource in all the world that Europe could get to rebuild its financial structure after the Middle Ages. The economy of Europe was rebuilt on slave trade. That, except for this slave trade, the economy of Europe would not have pulled out of the depression of the Middle Ages except for what was extracted from us. It did not start on its way to recovery in the United States, because the United States in this early period did not exist. The recovery started in the exploitation and on the plantation system of the Caribbean islands. How the people got there was a double miracle, because a question arose between slave sellers and shippers over tight pack versus loose pack. If they packed slaves tight, they were talking about the Middle Passage itself. How if they packed them tight in the ship through suffocation, large numbers of them would die. From 1/3 to 1/2 wouldn't reach the market. But if they packed them loose, they'd have enough breathing space, and could, in a godly manner of them, and a godly number of them would live through the ordeal and get to the market. So the argument became, it is more economic to loose pack or tight pack. No one was talking about or thinking about Africans as human beings. Sometimes the sickly and the rebellious were just thrown overboard. The total dehumanization is what has to be looked at. In the establishment of South America and the Caribbean islands, something happened there that didn't happen in the United States. The slave masters brought in large lots and kept the lots together. They thought that they could work them better that way. They were right, but they forgot that Africans could revolt better that way. They maintained cultural continuity to a great extent because they came from the same general area in Africa. They could speak the same language, and if you sold grandma or grandpa or uncle to someone on the other side of the island, they could walk to the other side of the island and see their relatives once in a while. There was a language that all of them understood, and that was a language of the drum. In the United States, they outlawed all African instruments and African religion, and this left the African in the United States without anything other than mental recall. Here, they brought in small lots and broke up those lots. When people do that, they break up the African loyalty system. We suffer to this day because they broke our loyalty system. This brokerage caused the creation of a cleavage between the field of black and the house. Excuse me, a cleavage between the field black and the house black. That's what Malcolm X was trying to explain. Now you can understand why in South America and in the Caribbean, many slave revolts were planned and executed by house servants, while in the United States, many of them were betrayed by house servants. It has nothing to do with which one of those were braver than the other. By breaking our cultural continuity, they broke the line of loyalty one to another. We look at these people in the house and we say, we do not know what tribe they came from. He didn't come from my tribe. I can tell by the scars on his face, he didn't come from my tribe. So I don't have any loyalty to him. He's up there eating food in the house while I'm out here eating this coarse food in the field. I don't have any feelings toward him. Who is he? But the man in the field in the Caribbean and the one in the house can tell by the speech and by the look on the other that they came from the same basic area in Africa and possibly from the same group. The Caribbeans misunderstood this to this day. Most Black Americans never knew it, but we have got to study both. I've studied it several ways, and I say if we're ever going to get to some effective kind of unity, understand that we've got to look at all of the Africans who were brought here. And we will have to pay some special attention to those in South America, especially Brazil, where the largest number exists today. They did more with African cultural continuity and with the consistency of it than any Africans in the New World, including Haiti. Did more with it by establishing two African states in Brazil, Bahia and Palmeiras, one which lasted 110 years. What I'm trying to show is that in a collective way, through the Africans in the Middle Passage and through what was extracted from them, an economy came into being, and that economy made possible the modern technical and scientific world of the West, that the world was built on our sweat and our labor, and our death now says what we cannot do when we struck at Africa. When Africa was on the verge of a pre-industrial age, we will never know what Africa could have been because they struck while Africa was growing. The internal differences between African state and African state were far less than those internal differences between European state and European state now. So I'm gonna move forward. So, because we got to get to this part, right? The one thing in conclusion I'm asking you to not do is to forgive and forget. Your mission is to remember, to teach your children so that they can remember it. It is because it happened to us. We have a special responsibility to ourselves to build a kind of humanity and partnership with all African people of the world that could serve as a role model for all of the African people of the world. I'm not saying that we have to be nicer than the other people in the God and the goody sense. I'm not talking about that at all. I'm not talking about nonviolence. I'm saying we are fortunate because the entire continent of Africa, every inch of it belongs to us. No matter where, no matter who is there, who lives in Africa, all of it is ours, and we don't have to quote scriptures to prove it. We are the only people with a continent that belongs solely to us. Once you put African people, their energy and their imagination together, and once they begin to feed into each other and support each other, there's no need for them to conquer anybody or threaten anybody. And they, above all other people, can offer the world a whole new humanity and a whole new way of life. They might be the only people who can give this world some kind of security because they can see the utter stupidity of automatic weaponry because they want to live in that provement. I think the fools who are playing with it now also want to have, but they think they can use it to kill others and still live themselves. I think that bringing all these new African people together will show the world that it would be a better place by virtue of them coming together and being successfully dependent upon themselves and delivering goods and service to themselves. They would improve not only the economy of the world, but the spirit of the world and the humanity of the world and the dignity of the world. But they would have to get some of the illusions out of their minds first. They have to develop an entirely different concept of education. Powerful people never educate you in how to take power away from them, right? Right? And their schools are not going to give you the kind of education you need. You have to make it or take it. You have to make it or take it. Power is not given, it is taken. When you get that kind of education you need, when you get the kind of education you need, you will discover the green fields of Africa, and you won't have to go to Africa to improve Africa. Africa is where you are. You start with your community and yourself, and then you will begin to see and understand revolutionary change. The greatest memorial that can be to the people of the Middle Passage, while I call for and strongly suggest a physical memorial in addition to a museum of slavery, preserving the ornamentations and chains and atrocities so that our children would know that it wasn't easy, would be to remind them of the work they still have to do. I think that the greatest change is going to have to be with each one of you, and your greatest memorial to those who died in the Middle Passage to be what each individual one of you does to bring revolutionary change to yourself and your community. I think you should start with the mirror. Look into the mirror until you like what you see, and then you say, my revolution starts with me, and my memorial to the people in the Middle Passage starts right now. I'm gonna say that again. My revolution starts with me, and my memorial to the people in the Middle Passage starts right now. My revolution starts with me, and my memorial to the people in the Middle Passage starts now. And that's the end of the book. And it's just notes on references from there. Great book. My revolution starts with me. Look in the mirror. Look in the mirror. My revolution starts with me. What are you going to do, Joseph? Start with me. Joseph, what are you going to do today, tomorrow, and the next day, and the next day, and the next day to make sure that you are being revolutionary? Mentally, physically, emotionally, spiritually, psychologically. How are you going to be revolutionary? And how are you going to inspire your community to be better? Questions I ask myself all the time. So I'm glad Dr. Clark is reminding myself and reminding us that it starts with us. Don't start with nobody else. It starts with us. Until we want it to be different and make it to be different, it ain't going to be different. Power is not given. Power is taken. Description, link to get a copy of this book is in the description. Make sure you check it out and get your copy of the book. Hit that like button. Hit that like button, comment, subscribe, share. Make sure you check out all of my videos from this past week. And, I love y'all. We're going to keep rocking and doing our thing. Peace out. Have a great Monday. Live life to the fullest.